Thank you so much. So my research interest is on pedagogical translanguaging and how we can support multilingual students, in my case to learn Italian, but any language, in university language courses. Why this research? Australia is a very multilingual and multicultural country. Students that come to the University of Melbourne to learn Italian speak already multiple languages. Local domestic students declare to speak more than 130 languages. Plus, we have a higher percentage of international students that add up to the wealth of linguistic resources that they bring to the classroom. So they know other languages. They have different linguistic practices, and they have already experience as language learners. They already learn other languages before. So part of my question is, how can I leverage this knowledge, this metalinguistic or this linguistic knowledge that they have in my language classes? So the research question I will focus in this presentation is, what are the affordances of pedagogical translanguaging for specifically writing processes, and more specifically collaborative writing processes in learning Italian? It's a very small case study. 11 students. So I selected these students that had completely one semester of Italian, so very beginners, 12 weeks of learning Italian, and decided not to continue. I had 11 volunteers. It was conducted during the pandemic, so through Zoom, which was a platform that the university would use. 6 lessons, about 90 minutes. And the focus was on, or the focus of the findings that I will share with you is on collaborative writing practices. I have highlighted 2 terms, key terms in my research question that I want to start with. What do I mean with pedagogical translanguaging, and what do I mean with affordances? I don't know if you are familiar with the concept of translanguaging. It's becoming more and more popular in research in Australia. It can be defined as the act performed by bilinguals or multilinguals of accessing different linguistic features or various modes of what are described as autonomous languages, Italian, English, Chinese, French, in order to maximize communicative potential. In the reality of the research, translanguaging is a wandering term. Aaron Singleton defined it as a wandering term because there is no agreed definition. It is in the literature can be found, we can see the term translanguaging used to define different theoretical concepts, different methodology. Sometimes is used in a critical and political form. So it's very complex at the moment. I think it's still quite young, probably is 10, 15 years old into its development. So my study fits into what is defined as pedagogical translanguaging. So my interest is in understanding or exploring this movement shifting across different languages, different modalities, but inside the language classroom, not in the multilingual experience or the communicative experience of multilinguals in society. I'm focusing on what happens in language learning if I promote or develop a course that explicitly facilitate or asks the students to refer to their previous knowledge of other languages. And I found that there's a gap in research. So most studies are focused on learning English as an additional language. So lots of studies on translanguaging are in English classes, but very few are in learning other languages. There are a few studies in learning Chinese as an additional language, but very, very small literature is available. What do I mean with affordances? So this is pedagogical translanguaging. Affordances is, I refer to the ecological perspective of Van Leer, anything that is available to the learner to do something with. So tools, tasks, instructions. But in my specific case, I used Garcia's definition of translanguaging affordances. So everything, tools, tasks, tools that can help me to raise awareness of linguistic repertoires, conditions, instructions, but that have a focus on leveraging other languages in the repertoire of the students, translanguaging affordances. And this is an example let's say, my experience with designing an Italian course through a pedagogical translanguaging perspective. The first step was opening what Leeway defines as a translanguaging space, a space where students feel comfortable to talk about other languages in their repertoire, to talk about other modalities they have in learning languages and their experience as language learners. How? By explaining the notion of translanguages, like I did with you a minute ago, very explicitly, but also by exploring, investigating their linguistic repertoire. And in this particular instance, I used language portrait. These are the language portraits of my 9, actually, because 2 were not there the first lesson. Which was a way for each individual students to reflect on their own experience with languages in a very broad way, not only what languages do you speak. Speak means a very specific thing, but anything that is related to languages in your experience. And this opened a very broad conceptualization of linguistic repertoire, but also helped me, it became like a collective, a shared space. Students knew each other also in relation to languages and language learning experiences. This was the first step, and inside this translanguaging space that I provided translanguaging affordances, instructions and resources to scaffold students to leverage their individual and collective repertoires. This is an example, and so instructions were mostly bilingual, very beginner students, so what they could understand in Italian was in Italian, but some suggestions, for example, the explicit request of leveraging or using other languages in their repertoire to complete the task were provided in English. So a bit of, showing them that when we learn languages, we refer to multiple languages that we already know, not just to the target language. And the other aspect was providing reflection, time for reflection. So they had a reflective journal with a few questions after each session, but also I provided some space inside the lessons where they could explain to the class the way they worked in their own small group in order to reflect on what happened with languages in each different group. And this was very beneficial because they modeled to each other ways of accessing their repertoires. It was very interesting to see how from the very first collaborative task to the final one, the way they decided to activate these translanguaging practices became more and more complex, and they expanded the reasons, the function for which they would use translanguaging strategies. Now I'm going to share a few findings in relation to these 3 collaborative writing pieces. So they had to write a short poem based on a structure that I gave them. They wrote together a story that we called a multilingual and multimodal story, because I provide them also some images to inspire the story. And they had to write a bilingual brochure. So little brochure for tourists, to invite tourists to this particular cultural event, Italian cultural event, but the text, I asked for the text to be bilingual in Italian and English. I use a process of analysis, of thematic analysis called moment analysis that Leeway developed for sociolinguistics context. So he uses moment analysis in analyzing conversation among multilinguals. I applied this to a pedagogical space of the language classroom. And it's a type of qualitative thematic analysis that focuses on the description of linguistic actions generated in multilingual exchanges through identifying critical moments, linguistic events with the potential of generating changes or development in subsequent conversation, or in my case, writing. through these critical moments, leeway says the learners or the multilingual speaker has opportunity to express creativity and criticality in using their languages, their linguistic repertoire, and in drawing on their full linguistic and sociocultural repertoires. And I'm going to show you some examples of how they activated these translanguaging practices. This is the very first collaborative task. The students knew each other only, they met only once before this task and online. So it was a bit challenging, the first one, but they came up with some very good ideas. And as you can see in the poem, there are two lines that are not in Italian. So the translanguaging, the movement across languages in this particular task was evident in the product. So the final poem has two lines, one in Spanish and one in English. It's not fully in the target language. Why? The first, I'm going to focus on the Spanish one, pero no me importaba. Why? Because they didn't know how to say, it didn't matter to me. And so the fact that, and here the translanguaging design comes in, rather than looking it up on the dictionary, one of the students said, oh, wait a moment, Elena said that we can use other languages. Can you say it in other languages? And the interesting thing is, they didn't use English, which was the language that was shared among all the students, even if not all of them were native speakers of English. Because one of the students said, oh, I can say it in Spanish. My brain is thinking in Spanish here. And in the end, they decided to, okay, just tell us, how do we say this? I put it in the chat. Okay, decision made, they used the Spanish. Why? So the initial prompt, the reason was, they didn't know how to say in Italian. The function was to overcome limitation in communication. But when I asked them why not English, they said to me, they gave me two reasons. One was kind of aesthetic. They said to me, oh, it's a poem. It needs to sound nicely. So they have a meta-linguistic or meta-knowledge of the genre. It's a poem, needs to sound nice. Spanish sounds nice than English in this particular sentence. And the other reason they gave me was, we thought that Spanish might be very similar to Italian compared to English. So we thought it could be a good way. And actually, I used this and to teach them. And it's true, pero no me importaba, pero no me importaba. Perfect, it sounds very Italian. So yes, it's they want to overcome a limitation in communication, but they put some agency. They wanted to use the language that they wanted to use. And for example, for the other expression, they knew how to say it in Italian, even if grammatically is not perfectly correct, but they decided to use English because the character, Philip Glass, is an English speaker, so he needs to speak English. So, what I'm trying to say is it's not only learning Italian and improving my Italian, but also expressing myself and what I really want to say in using the target language. Second example, it's an evolution of the first one. In this case, I'm going to highlight this sentence, la luna è fatta di formaggio, the moon is made of cheese. It's a passive form of the verb. Very beginner students said, we're not sure how to say it. But if I look, it's in Italian. I can't see the translanguaging process happening. It happened in the process of generating the sentence, where one of the students said, like fatto di formaggio, possibly, I don't actually know. That's what it would be in French. She was a competent speaker of French, so she explained to the class in French it would be this way. So I guess it might be the same. And the interesting thing that I noticed is the group trusted her expertise. She said, okay, if you say so, it should be fine. And it's actually grammatically correct. So another way of overcoming limitation in their communication they didn't know how to say is not using another language, but transferring grammatical knowledge from one language to another, which can work only in similar languages, but maybe we'll come back to this later. Another example, this is a different reason that they they used English, which was the shared and stronger language, to decide which word to use in Italian to express exactly that meaning. So they wanted to express, how would you say you sensed you know, the idea they did not sense the beauty of the music. How do you say sensed in Italian? And the conversation was using English to explain the nuances of the word sentito. We say, in Italiano, we say sentito, but one said, oh no, that's heard, it's not sensed. And so the discussion was back and forth in analyzing the meaning until they decided which one was the exact meaning they wanted to express. And the final example is where more, you know, agency and decisions on how to use the language, sometimes also in forms that are a bit divergent compared to the standard Italian, but that shows the decision, the agency in using the target language. So the bilingual brochure, interesting was that I thought that for beginner students, maybe the English version would be a bit more, you know, rich. When they ask each other, but are we directly translating or we have a little bit of freedom? Oh, they said, oh no, you know, we have a bit of freedom, it must be pretty much the same. And the interesting thing is that the Italian version was much more complex. Rather than say only a spider, they said they named the spider, also it should be tarantola, but you know, very similar, una taranta che può suonare il violino. No, che pazzo. Much more complex. In one sentence, they were able to summarize the core, the heart of this celebration, cultural celebration. And even if maybe a native speaker would say, no, che pazzia, probably not che pazzo, it's not grammatically incorrect. They are agent of their own way to use the new language that they are learning. So to summarize, language students responded to the pedagogical translanguaging design of the course by activating translanguaging strategies for overcoming limitations in communication, to negotiate meaning, or to assert their agency or authorship. So I would conclude that pedagogical translanguaging facilitates writing processes, but it's a negotiation, it's a co-construction between the teacher that opens the translanguaging space and created the translanguaging design, the students that share their linguistic repertoire, they decide or not to refer to their repertoires, they respond collectively to the task and they reflect on the writing process. And this brings to some interesting results. This is the same in a more visual way, but the results can tell me that their writing style show an enhanced linguistic competence compared to a very beginner class with higher complexity in language use, for example, the passive form of the verb, and more interesting content. And that means that they can express themselves, they feel more engaged, they experiment with non-standard use of the language, they choose how to express content. So I have just a couple of implications for teaching that I would like to keep in mind in my future teaching of Italian. Translanguaging is the work of the teacher and the students. It's something that is co-constructed, that is negotiated continuously and evolves across the course. But I believe that by introducing effective tools to investigate the linguistic repertoire of students, it's a first step, and especially not doing so individually, but bring together and make the students share the language portrait in my case, or other tools, other ways where they can talk about their linguistic repertoire together, providing translanguaging affordances, so the translanguaging design of the course, telling them explicitly, you can, yes, please do, experiment with the language, introduce other competencies that you have. And most of all, I think including collaborative tasks was a very effective way of facilitating translanguaging practices for my students. I think that's all from me. And